upon a time, in a distant future, there was a desert. This desert was mostly full of happy armadillos, but at opposite ends there resided two robots. Since they lived at opposite sides of the desert, neither of them knew the other existed. One was a robot with no arms, but with fantastically speedy tank treads. He was a happy robot, and he enjoyed zooming through the desert at breakneck speeds. The robot with no arms had a refrigerator in his chest that had an automatically replenishing supply of refreshing beverages, which he shared with the armadillos. In return, since he had no arms to help himself, the armadillos would help him drink the beverages. However, he was alone more often than not, and was frequently sad and thirsty. At the other end of the desert, there lived a robot with no mouth, but with fantastically extendable arms. The robot with no mouth had a microwave in his chest that could produce delicious hamburgers whenever he so desired. And since he had no mouth, he could not speak, nor could he eat any of the delectable hamburgers. He shared them with the armadillos, but it saddened him that he could not eat any hamburgers himself. One day, the robot with no mouth decided to set out on a long walk to see what was on the other side of the desert. He left a supply of hamburgers with his armadillo friends, so they would not be hungry in his absence. Coincidentally, the robot with no arms also decided to go on a long walk across the desert. The armadillo sadly waved goodbye as he departed. The robot with no arms speedily rolled through the desert sand. The robot with no mouth jogged straight ahead. And they rolled, and they jogged. And they rolled, and they jogged. Then, as the robot with no arms was zipping along on his speedy treads, not looking where he was going, he suddenly collided with the robot with no mouth. Dazed, the two robots recovered from their crash. Once they got over the initial shock, the robot with no arms eventually got to talking with the robot with no mouth, who could only gesture and use sign language. Even though the large robot was mute, the smaller robot was able to understand his new friend with no problem. They talked and talked. They talked about living in the desert and their armadillo friends. Then they discovered they both had the ability to produce delicious treats, yet they were unable to enjoy them on their own. Realizing the smaller robot's problem, the robot with no mouth assisted his new friend in getting a drink and prepared a tasty hamburger for him. The small robot thanked the large robot for his help and told him of his desire for arms of his own. Suddenly, the robot with no mouth had a brilliant idea. He realized he could make a difference for his new friend. The robot with no arms looked on in amazement as the taller robot detached one of his own extendable arms. He was shocked and overjoyed as his friend tightened the marvelous appendage into place right on top of his head. It was a perfect fit, and it functioned wonderfully. "Thank you!" exclaimed the now one-armed robot as he helped himself to one of his deliciously refreshing beverages. "You're quite welcome," a new voice replied. The two robots were astounded as they looked around. Where did that voice come from? Suddenly, they realized that the hole that was left when the big robot selflessly detached his arm was actually a perfectly functioning mouth. "I can talk!" whooped the tall one-armed robot. "And eat!" added his smaller friend. For the first time in his life, the big robot was able to relish the delicious taste of his own delectable hamburgers. "Hooray!" both robots shouted and cheered, overjoyed with the new abilities they had gained. And so the tall one-armed robot and the short one-armed robot sat down with their armadillo friends and enjoyed a picnic of delicious hamburgers and refreshing beverages. And they lived happily ever after. The end.